Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Pavan Mano, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Vincent Park. Hello, Vincent.
Hi, Pavan.
Now, Vincent is assistant lecturer in the School of English at the University of Hong Kong. And today, Vincent's going to be telling us about his new book, Queer Correctives, Discursive Neo-homophobia, Sexuality and Christianity in Singapore, published by Bloomsbury Academic. Why don't we kick off, Vincent, with the dreaded question, but the question which I'll force you to answer anyway. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
It sounds like a dating question. My name is Vincent. I am originally from Singapore. I went to school in Singapore. I grew up there, and I completed my PhD in a joint program between the National University of Singapore and King's College London, like yourself. My PhD was in English language and linguistics, so that was almost 2 years ago in 2023. So I lived in the UK for a while, worked there, and then now I'm based in Hong Kong. I now teach at the School of English at the University of Hong Kong. In terms of how I identify professionally, there's a bit of an identity crisis where I'm trained as a linguist formally, both at the undergrad level and also in graduate school. But some linguists may not consider what I do as linguistics. So these days I tend to position myself as working in the field of on the fields of sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology. I'm broadly interested in discourse studies, but with a focus on gender and sexuality. I funnily started off my interests in these fields as someone that was reading a lot of Judith Butler. So I was very interested in feminist theory and also gender studies in general. But later I focused on sexuality in graduate school. So that's me.
Excellent. Well, so Queer Correctives is your first monograph, and I imagine the product of all of this identity crisis and professional befuddlement that you're experiencing. So maybe that is a good way to kind of segue to the next question. Tell us a little bit about how you came to write Queer Correctives and everything else that's related to it.
It's you've also written your book quite recently, so you know how crazy the whole journey is. It was quite a long project for me. If I really were to bring it back to where I started brainstorming and also conceptualizing the book, it started in 2018 when I was still an undergrad. I was preparing for grad school. And I was applying, or rather I was preparing to apply. 2018 was also the year that True Love Is, which is the organization that most of my book is based on, became operational. I really wanted to work on what they were doing for my undergrad work, my undergrad thesis. But I found that I didn't really have the resources and sort of the knowledge or the training yet at the undergrad level. So I decided to put it aside for then. And I eventually wrote about coming out narratives for Singaporean gay men as my undergrad thesis. And when I went to graduate school, or rather when I applied to graduate school, I proposed working on this topic as part of the dissertation. And it was, I guess, well received then. And then eventually when I passed my qualifying exams in year 2, I think, of the PhD, I then started to find that I was a bit more confident in working on this topic. I didn't really want to focus solely on True Love Is for data. So I also spent a couple of months doing some field work in Singapore, and this was during the COVID pandemic as well. So this was 2020, right at sort of the thick of it, of the pandemic, and it did make data collection quite difficult because it was hard for me to, first of all, get people to participate in the interviews, and also to interview them in person because of the restrictions. So that was tricky. But eventually I did manage to interview about 21 people. And I specifically focused on religious sexual minorities in Singapore to see if their experiences were similar to what I noticed about True Love Is. These were interviewees of all religious backgrounds. So I had interviewees that were Buddhists. Some of them were Hindu. Some of them were also Christian and Catholic. But eventually I only focused on the Christian and Catholic experiences, and also some Muslim interviewees as well. And eventually, I wrote the dissertation and passed Viva, and I decided to rewrite some parts of the dissertation to package it as a monograph, and that's how it happened. It was initially titled Homecoming Queer. I was trying to be clever with the name because it sounded like Homecoming Queen, but Homecoming Queer. But it was too similar to another monograph of a very similar title. It was called Homecoming Queers. So my editor suggested that I change the name. So that's how we settled on Queer Correctives as the title.
Yeah, because if you had titled yours Homecoming Queer, it obviously would have overshadowed what was already out there. So that could not have been allowed to happen. Where else should we begin about the introduction? As most people do. And my eye was drawn to, well, you associate with this guy called William Hogarth a lot, in the opening lines anyway. And I was drawn to that both personally because I happen to live on Hogarth Roundabout, which, is the part of London which is almost enthralled to William Hogarth, but also intellectually. One thing about William Hogarth, did you know, Hogarth's best known dog, answered to the name of Trump.
Oh no!
Yes, yeah. So that's a trivia, a fact, as it were, a fact. But yes, unfortunately, well, I guess it was fine then, and it's one of those that is not that great now. But so yes, that was something about William Hogarth, who's also buried quite close to where I live. In any case, intellectually, William Hogarth is an interesting character in your book, and you draw on Hogarth because you talk about Hogarth and his commentary, I suppose, on line. So you make references to the line and lines a lot. It's a recurring motif in your book. So tell us a little bit about how this is conceptually important to, how you theorize and how you think about sexuality via the motif of the line.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to know that you resonate so well with Hogarth's work. Admittedly, I don't think I'm as familiar with his stuff as I should be. But I got to know about his work on aesthetics when I was reading another book. It was called Life Destroying Diagrams, and it was basically a film theory book that talked about horror and horror movies or horror in general, and form or formalism. And Hogarth was mentioned in it, and I thought that what he was talking about in terms of the straight line and the curved line was very interesting. But I think how I started thinking about lines and also drawing that link between lines and sexuality was when I started reading more about like queer theory in general. But also quite a few scholars have already made that connection between sexuality and orientation, most prominently in Sarah Ahmed's work. The book's called Queer Phenomenology. And these scholars have tried to spatialize queerness in some way, that it's not only queer desires that are non-normative or they're askew or they're offline in some way, but also the trajectories of their lives, both in terms of time and space. I think it was Elizabeth Freeman who talked about normativity in time as well. But what really inspired the motif, as to use a word, of the line was this scholar called Yi-Fu Tuan, who is a humanistic geographer, and he wrote this really, really famous book called Space and Place. And in the first chapter, he included a schematic for to describe or to show how many more adjectives there were for lines than there were for curves in the English language. And his point was that this difference in the number of adjectives could be indicative of what is considered important for a particular culture. I guess in this case, maybe English speakers or Anglophone culture. So you have a lot more ways to describe lines as compared to curves. So I thought that was very illuminating. It's something that I didn't really think about or notice at first. And then I started looking into lines a little bit more. I also made some comparisons with geometry, the definition of a line and how it's the sort of an elongated mark between 2 points. It's the fastest way to get from one point to the other. And also out of my own personal interest, one of my favorite films is from the Alien franchise, if you're familiar with that. One of the, I think in terms of the timeline of the Alien franchise, Prometheus was one of the first movies. And one of the starting scenes was when these archaeologists were landing on a new planet that they believe to be where the creators of humanity lived, right? So they were our masters in some way. And so they were on the spaceship, and as they were landing, there were these landscapes and mountains. And then one of the archaeologists jumps from his seat and he says, God does not build in straight lines. And he was referring to these roads and runways that he noticed from the spacecraft, right? There's this sort of grid-like formation on land, and they decided to land there. And he said that because the sort of the main point of that line was that lines or straight lines in particular, were a marker of humanity in some way. Humans must have created these straight lines, and that's evidence of humanity. So there seems to be an obsession with straight lines that we have, and it does appear a lot in our lives. It's usually a marker of order, of civility. It compresses time and space in the sense that it allows us to get from one point to another most efficiently. It seems to be what makes us human. And so that's how I wanted to make the link between lines and also non-normative sexualities.
Yeah, I mean, I find that quite interesting in what you're saying, that particularly this sentiment that lines are socially produced and constructed in many ways. And in the introduction, there's quite early on, there's a line, if I may, where you say that you kind of quote Sarah Ahmed, right? And you say that Sarah Ahmed describes the act of following a line in life as a form of commitment as well as social investment, before going on to talk about how Sarah talks about the idea of lifelines, with her own experience of living as a lesbian woman after previously identifying as heterosexual. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about, the line conceptually and how you make that connection to sexuality. It will be obvious to many listeners, but maybe not so to everyone. So I wonder if you could just lay that out a little bit, the link between the line, and I think you're kind of getting towards it. The idea that lines are socially produced and constructed, and it's kind of how that allows you to make a link to sexuality, or what is that kind of link you're making?
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I've tried to do when I was initially talking about the book was to have my audience members draw lines on a piece of paper. So I would, without sort of contextualizing it, I would just say to draw a line on the paper, and then the next instruction would be to draw a straight line. And more often than not, I think most people draw straight lines for both instructions. And the point I'm trying to make there is that there is an assumption that a line is straight, right? And that seems to be the norm when it comes to thinking about lines. And so my question is, why is there that assumption that lines are straight? Of course, when I use the word straight, it's also that double meaning where it's also referring to heterosexuality, right? So what I am trying to do with this whole metaphor of the line is that we assume sexuality to be straight, and any other sort of deviation is seen as abnormal or unwanted in some way. And that's also how we see non-normative sexualities, which is why I tried to use this line to think about sexuality and why we want to correct, or why there seems to be a desire to correct any line that is not straight. Because we like straight lines, we seem to have an obsession with it. And so that's where the whole idea of correctives came about. It's that sort of desire for what I've called, I guess, the ontology of lines, which is that value of straightness, that rather than wanting to have a straight line, it's that inherent or ontological property of lines as straight that we seem to desire.
I think we've missed an opportunity, Vincent, to get the listeners to carry out this exercise. You've given the trick away. We could have asked them to draw lines, but you've let the cat out of the bag. So we need to move on. Thank you very much. That was great. And I think that will help us in the rest of the conversation, because in the next chapter, so you talk about the formation of the queer sinner, which is also when we meet this entity called true love is. Tell us more about this. What is true love is, firstly, and then what do you mean by the formation of the queer sinner?
So true love is sort of the main character for the entire book. It features in most of the chapters. They are, or rather, they identify themselves as a non-denominational Christian organization, meaning that they don't exactly align themselves with a specific denomination. Rather, they just sort of keep that information unsaid. So I've decided that non-denominational is the best way to describe them. They are part of a larger church. So they call themselves a ministry, but they're also part of a larger church in Singapore called 316 Church, which has existed for longer. But True Love is themselves only officially they officially came out on the scene, I guess, in 2018. When they first sort of started making rounds on social media, it was based on a video that they've uploaded. It was a video testimonial of one of their, what I've called storytellers, where it was a woman who was talking about how she fell in love with another woman, and that didn't end so well. But she found hope in Christianity, and she's decided that this is the kind of life that she wants to be aligned with biblical teachings, and she's sort of given up her same-sex desires. And when that video first came up, it really became quite popular because a lot of Singaporeans latched on to the video as evidence of modern day conversion therapy. I'm quoting from an article that came out quite recently after True Love is appeared, and they of course have denied conducting any sort of conversion therapy at that point, but they also started ramping up their production. So they started to release a lot more video testimonials, and it was of course it was disturbing, but it was also very exciting to watch because they were really gaining a lot of traction, and they were controversial in a different way, and it gave people something to talk about. I think right now they've really sort of slowed down their video testimonials, so they're no longer producing as many, but they're more active on Instagram and also Facebook, where they post sort of maybe motivational quotes and things like that these days. Not so much video testimonials. So that's who they are. They have these storytellers that I think they featured.
Sorry, I'm just motivational in what sense? What kind of motivational quotes are we talking about?
Oh, so they would say things like, should the church really support gay people, for example? And then they would quote scripture, and then they do take quite, I guess, a unique position in terms of if you compare it to past sort of discourse on sexuality or non-normative sexuality that comes from the Christians. They do tend to be a bit more progressive. So they encourage people to come out. They encourage people to come home. That's their tagline: "Come out, come home." And they say that we should treat gay people with grace, and we should accept them. We should love them. So it's very much a very positive embracing of gay people, which is quite different from what I used to read about.
Okay, so these are not those cringy motivational quotes of success is a journey, it's not that kind of.
No. Yeah, they're a bit more Gen Z, I think.
Yes. Okay, and it's aimed at sexuality, and it has a different positioning of, in particular, homosexuality. Mm-hmm. So you use the word, and I'm interested in this as well. You used the word earlier, same-sex desire.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds unusual to me. Is that a new term?
I don't think it's a new term per se. I think maybe scholars have used it in the past as well. It seems to be a way of describing homosexuality in a way that does not assume identity, right? So I think these days we say gay and lesbian and bisexual a lot, and these are all predicated on identity, but same-sex desire sort of shifts that focus away from identity towards desire. So it's more like object choice rather than who you are.
Right. Okay. So I cut you off as you were, I imagine, transitioning towards the notion of the formation of the queer sinner. Please continue.
So so the queer sinner is something that they didn't come up with. I came up with it when I was writing the book as an analytical point of departure. It draws from, it doesn't come out of nowhere, of course. It draws from True Love Is's own demarcation of an in-group identity that they have called Christians with unwanted same-sex attraction. It's quite a mouthful. It's quite a long name, but they do explicitly sort of label this identity as something that all of their storytellers have, or that they are a Christian with unwanted same-sex attraction. This is an explicit in-group identity that they want to market as desirable for Christians with same-sex desires. But to do this, there must be a foil against which they can position themselves, right? So in order to identify as this in-group, there must be an out-group that they are identifying against. And so I started to think about who exactly are they trying to get away from, to identify as this Christian with unwanted same-sex attraction. And so I came up with the identity also of the queer sinner that they have constructed for their storytellers that they were before they became a Christian with unwanted same-sex attraction. So the queer sinner is that foil. It's an explicit identity category that comprises of various traits or characteristics. And in the book, I specifically identify these as, firstly, addictive behavior, and then secondly, same-sex indulgences. The former is marked by impulsion of sorts. It's something that they cannot fight against, and they do use a lot of, I guess, linguistic strategies to show that they're sort of unable to resist partaking in same-sex behavior or having, I guess, casual sex with the same sex. Whereas for same-sex indulgences, this is more of a calculated, conscious decision to engage in same-sex behavior. So that's the sort of distinction that I've made. But together, they form what I've called the queer sinner, which is constructed rather than innate, right? And the whole point of these video testimonials is to show how they have moved from being a queer sinner to finding Christianity, and then now they've settled as a Christian with unwanted same-sex attraction.
So in some of these stories, coming out of true love is, you talk about the space-time dimensions around them, particularly in relation to the Bakhtinian notion of the chronotope, right? Tell us a little bit more about this. How is space and time organized in these stories, and what do you find particularly significant about that?
So this, the whole, Bakhtinian chronotope was, it's a chapter after the queer sinner, and I deliberately placed it after because it's sort of a more macro look at true love is video testimonials as data. So for the queer sinner sort of analysis, it was I took a closer look at the content of the videos. And then when I moved to the chronotope bit, I was zooming out a little bit to look at the sort of the form of the stories, the structure of the stories as a repertoire. So I when I was looking at these videos, and they've got I think I looked at about 18 videos in total. There was quite an obvious pattern in the way that True Love was telling these stories. And these stories follow a pattern that is mostly chronological. They go from, they follow the linear flow of time, but some of them involve shifting around elements of the story. My sort of intervention is identifying these elements as a chronotope, and the chronotope is, of course, taken from Bakhtin's theory, where he looks at these literary novels and identified the chronotope as specifically, or rather simplistically understood as space-time. Chronos as in time, and tropos as in space. So it originated from literary theory, but linguistic anthropologists have sort of co-opted it, stole it, and they used it as a point of analysis, where narratives usually deploy these chronotopes as what linguistic anthropologists have called invocable histories. It's another way of thinking about context, right? So anything that we say or do is always governed or constrained by the time period that we are in, and also the space that we are in. So it's really a more complicated way to think about context or contextualization. So for True Love Is, the stories follow the pattern of a very specific pattern of when the storytellers in their youth, so as a kid, which always involves some sort of traumatic event, and then they shift towards adulthood. And then after that, it's when they find Christianity, and then finally the last chronotope is the present day self. So that's a very chronological flow, but some of these stories also involve the shifting around of the chronotopes. So sometimes the youth chronotope gets shifted to the second or third position of this order, and that changes the way that audiences, or at least that's my argument, how the audiences would receive this information, how they make meanings from the stories as it's presented as a whole. So that's broadly what the chapter is about.
Would it be a kind of rhetorical device? Am I misunderstanding that? Or
in a way, I think I've also linked all of that to affect theory of sorts, or rather the ideas of how affect can flow between parts of a story. So when we are presented with a chronological, linear flowing story, the story makes sense, and we are sort of experiencing a very expected sort of trajectory of how we would feel when we encounter a story. But when these elements are shifted around, it sort of changes the kind of excitement or sadness that we feel at different parts of the story, and that has an impact on the kind of meaning-making processes that occur when we watch these stories.
Right. What interests you about truth-telling? So it's clearly an important concept to you, and you spend an entire chapter on it. So this is three questions in one. It's a trap, Vincent. It's 3 questions in one sentence. Tell us a little bit more about truth-telling, as well as this concept that you term and theorize, discursive metanoia. And the third thing, how does it operate in the political context of Singapore?
Wow, that's a lot of questions.
That's a lot.
You might have to remind me of the questions.
Let's start with truth-telling. So, tell us a little bit more about truth-telling.
Yeah, I think truth-telling was one of those things that really stood out to me when I was reading a lot about Foucault and his work, Michel Foucault's work, and whose work features quite prominently in the book. I draw a lot from his ideas, and if you've read the first volume of the History of Sexuality, which is probably one of his most famous works, there is a line in there that says, the Western man has become a confessing animal. And so the idea of confession stood out to me a lot. It really made me realize that a lot of what we say or what we disclose is just permutations of the ancient practice of confession. And of course, it originates from Catholicism in the church, but now the confession has taken on more contemporary forms. We confess. If you want to use a more recent example, you have YouTubers coming out online. You have politicians or celebrities confessing or apologizing for their indiscretions with each other. These are all, I guess, more modern forms of the confession. And so that's what got me interested in truth-telling. And I wanted to see how truth-telling would work in the interview data that I collected. So I've shifted away from True Love Is, and this chapter focuses on the interview data that I've collected. So it really is about what Foucault says, that there is a difference between truth-telling and truth-doing. And both are sort of ways to extract the truth from oneself. But I wanted to focus on truth-telling because of the element of verbalization. So Foucault does talk a lot about verbalizing the truth, but he doesn't really, I mean, he was not a linguist, but he doesn't really link it to, I guess, communication theory or linguistic theory. So one of the main goals of this chapter was to explicitly theorize truth-telling as a linguistic act, right? That it does something when we tell the truth. So based on the interview data, you would see that there was some of my interviewees' experiences where they were maybe made to say certain things about themselves. For example, that their sexuality is heterosexual, or that their gender identity is something that they're not. And because there is this belief that telling the truth will make it happen, or it will materialize some sort of outcome that is normatively desired. So that's how.
So how do you thread this into the concept of discursive metanoia? It's something that you've theorized in that chapter. How does this feed into it?
So the discursive metanoia is a concept that I've sort of put together for the sake of the book. But the idea of metanoia is not new. It's very, I guess, maybe not so much commonly known with the Christian community, but it does appear a lot in biblical, I guess, discourse. And it's this idea of change and transformation, or rather specifically spiritual change and transformation. I wanted to focus on metanoia as an idea, again, because of Foucault. He talks about it in his latest posthumous publication of the History of Sexuality, the fourth volume. And he talks about metanoia a lot as a process of spiritual change. And I think because of how true love has been talked about in the public sphere, especially by activists who try to pin it down as convergent therapy, I found that not so useful in terms of thinking about what true love is doing. Rather, I think what they're advocating for is change and transformation. I think that is their strategy. They want to make it such that things are more neutral, and they are calling for people to literally reorientate themselves towards the Bible, towards Jesus. And in that process of changing and transforming themselves spiritually, the sort of non-normative sexual desires will also be corrected in some way, which is how that links to a truth-telling, because Foucault argues that truth-telling, when we tell the truth about ourselves, it involves a rupture in our identity. It involves a externalization of our sins, of our bad behavior, and that primes us for that sort of change and transformation.
So you don't talk about this in abstract, right? So in this is the sort of the final clause, I suppose, of the title, that all of this is happening in Singapore. True Love is an organization or an entity in Singapore. And you theorize discursive metanoia as well as, the Foucauldian notion of truth-telling within this context. So how do you see this operating within the social political context of the country? Is it significant? How has it worked into your theorization of that concept and that chapter?
Yeah, so I think one thing, when I was writing the book, at the end of it, I was asking myself, how does this all go back to home? How does this lead me back home, which I understand as Singapore? And one of the related questions was, why is this phenomenon of discursive metanoia happening in a place like Singapore? What is it about Singapore that allows discursive metanoia to happen? And so I started looking into sort of the maybe more recent partnerships between church and state, right? I'm not saying that there is an explicit endorsement of Christianity as a religion that's maybe more important than the other religions. This is not true at all. But rather, I think there have been case studies in the past in Singapore where there seems to be an alignment of church and state interests, and this all converge on the idea that that non-heterosexual people do not serve these interests. And so I talked about 2 episodes in Singapore that have happened, and one of them is what is more commonly known as the Aware saga. Aware is a feminist organization that was notoriously taken over by a group of Christian women, and they were these group of Christian women took over the organization because they were upset with the sort of pro the pro homosexuality sort of narrative that Aware was advocating for, and they said, "Oh, we need to bring it back to Christian values, and this is what Singapore would want." And then also the other episode that also happened was this other group called Love Singapore that organized these prayer walks, what they would call prayer walks, and they would literally walk around the country and they would pray for Singapore. And then one of these other things that they were doing was to go to each apartment building, each apartment block, and they would also spread the word in some way, literally quite, or rather, evangelizing in the country that is supposed to be secular. So there seems to be, I think, these 2 episodes point towards a desire for certain groups of people to align themselves with the more, I guess, conservative social policies of Singapore, where heterosexuality is still the norm and still celebrated, and we don't really want to bring in queerness into the equation. And so it's in this context that I think have allowed discursive metanoia to germinate as a form of what I've called neo-homophobia. It's in this context that have allowed True Love is to have the kind of discourse that they do. Is sort of a not so explicit homophobic attempt to denounce non-heterosexuality, but it's also it's very implicit in some way. It's very covert.
Well, so in the book, you use a number of terms. You just used the term homophobia, but in the book, you use a number of terms that I suspect are related, but not synonymous and not identical, right? So you have homophobia, neo-homophobia, anti-queer, queer animus. So I don't want to be pedantic, but I think, as I suspect you also do, that there is some value in distinguishing between these various terms. Is that the case?
Yes. So admittedly, I think I didn't want to repeat myself too much by using the same term. So part of my reason for using these different terms was to eschew repetition. But I think one distinction that I want to make between homophobia and neo-homophobia is maybe more theoretical. I do subsume neo-homophobia as a subset of homophobia, but I use the sort of the prefix neo to sort of mark that resurgence, but also emergence of a new form of homophobia that is not quite as recognizable as what we used to see in the past, especially in Singapore, where if we're talking about sort of just anti-queer or homophobic sort of statements, the church used to be a lot more open about celebrating changes to non-heterosexuality. But with True Love it's more covert, it's more subtle. And so the prefix of neo, I think, was to highlight that shift in discursive tactics. Something that I do wish I did a bit better in the book was to bring up the link between neo-homophobia and neoliberalism, and that sort of I do talk about it a little bit in the book, but I wish I did that more. And it was to make that link between the individual, right? I wanted to show how these changes, or rather, anti-queer sentiment has been individualized. These changes are expected to be made by the individual now, right? The onus is on the queer Christian to change themselves, to transform themselves. And I think this, in a way, gives organizations like True Love is a free pass, so that they can say, you know what, I'm not responsible for any changes, but if these changes occur, it's agentive, right? These people have chosen to do it themselves, and it's not up to us. So we cannot be blamed. And I wish I sort of brought that out a little bit more in the book. But that's sort of the distinction that I wanted to make between homophobia and neo-homophobia.
Yeah, excellent. Well, listen, Vincent, we've taken up a lot of your time, and this has been really interesting. It's been wonderful chatting to you and learning about your book, and hearing about it more. The traditional final question I ask on here is, what is the next project you're looking forward to?
Do you want to hear an academic project or a non-academic project?
Well, I guess the choice is yours, really. But I could say both.
Okay, I'll do both. Let me start with the academic one. So I think maybe I've always worked a lot on sexuality, but I think maybe it's a good time with the publication of this book. It might be a good time to sort of shift my focus a little bit away from sort of a full-on sexuality studies. And I guess maybe more predictably, I wanted to focus on sort of the recent emergence of AI companions. With the whole AI era that we're in now. I'm sort of quite taken by the emergence of AI companions, how chatbots are used to generate these characters that users can relate to and have some sort of a relationship with, right? So I'm very interested in how users themselves use natural language to quite literally construct and generate a companion that is, I guess, assembled by these linguistic cues or forms. And then on the other hand, how these AI companions, which are basically excellent text prediction software, they can simulate that empathy, that wisdom, that intimacy that the user is looking for. So it's sort of that human-machine interaction that I'm interested in. There's a lot more work to be done. The ideas are very rough, but that might be something that I want to work towards in the future. And then for the non-academic projects, I think I really want to start watching more horror movies. I've always had an interest in, I guess, the macabre and just everything that's horror related, horror games, horror movies, and maybe I'll find some sort of link there to also my research. So yes, definitely more.
Yes, AI is the horror, Vincent. That is the horror that we are faced with. The research is the non-academic stuff that you're also working on. Terrific. All of that sounds really grand. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how it develops. Listen, I want to thank you for being on New Books Network with us today. It was brilliant. And thank you, listener, for tuning in. Queer Correctives is out now with Bloomsbury Academic, and you can get it directly from their website as well as other major booksellers. You will also enjoy the bonus of appearing very well read if you're holding a copy of it. But until next time, stay well and take care.
Thank you, Pavin.